Hello, my name is Todd Baginski. I'm an 11-time SharePoint MVP and a partner and CTO at my company Canviz. In this training module, I'm going to show you how to work with SharePoint context when developing SharePoint Framework components. This is section 1 of the Working with SharePoint Context training module. In this section, I will discuss using mock data to simulate SharePoint data. In this section, I will describe what mock data is, why we will use mock data, and how to use mock data inside of a SharePoint Framework web part. So what is mock data? Well, mock data is a fake. It's not real live data, but mock data simulates dynamic data returned from SharePoint or another data source. So why would we want to use it? Well, when you're doing development in the SharePoint framework, the local workbench has no SharePoint context. Therefore, you can use mock data to simulate that you have SharePoint context, which allows you to build the web part locally without even running it in SharePoint. It gives you the ability to implement the different UI behaviors and layouts even without accessing the SharePoint code and the real SharePoint environment. It's a good practice to have mock data for local workbench hosting when you do your development. So how do you use mock data? Well, the first step you need to do is to create a data model for the mock data. Here you can see I've created a class named isplist.ts inside of my Hello World web part project. And here is the code which actually defines the interface for the data model corresponding to my mock data. I've named this interface isplist to represent a SharePoint list. This interface will allow me to create multiple simulated or mocked list items, each of them having a title and ID, which have a string data type. After you've created the interface, the next thing you need to do is create a mock HTTP client class. This will simulate the SharePoint HTTP client class and allow us to return our mock data. After I've created the class, I need to import the data model into that mock HTTP client class. Then I need to create an instance of that data model, populate that instance of the data model with my mock data, and then create a method that will allow me to return the mock data from my mock HTTP client class. You can see in the screenshot from Visual Studio Code in the bottom left, I've named the class mock HTTP client.ts, and the implementation code that does what you see in the bullet points at the top of the screen is contained within this slide as well. You can see in the items collection that I'm making based on the ISP list interface that I have two mock list items that I've created, and I've assigned a title and an ID for both of them. You can also see my method at the bottom called get, which is going to return that mock data when it is invoked from this class. So after you have your interface defined and your class created, how do you actually go about using it? Well, the first thing you'll need to do is import the mock HTTP client class and the data model into the web part class so you can actually use it. You can see that in the first two statements of the code sample here. Then you'll need to create a method to invoke the method in your mock HTTP client to return that mock data. It's a good idea to check the environment type to determine if the web part is running in the local environment. If it is, as you can see in the if statement on the bottom of this code sample, then I'm going to go ahead and invoke the get mock list data method, which in turn invokes the get method on my mock HTTP client class. So essentially what we're doing here is we're saying if we're running in the local environment, then go invoke the mock HTTP client's get method to return that mock data that we created inside of that method. Now I'm going to walk you through a demo to show you this actually in practice and how we can use mocks to simulate SharePoint data. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to use mocks to simulate SharePoint data. So my starting point for this demo is the Hello World web part React project that was created in Module 1. So this is the out-of-the-box Hello World web part you get when you run the Yeoman generator and pick React as your JavaScript framework. The first thing I did to that web part was I created this new file here, isplist.ts. And so inside of this, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is my interface, which is going to represent a SharePoint list item. So I have a title and a string that I'm using to represent the two values for those list items. You can see those where my web part is actually running here on the right side of the screen. So here is that ID value, and here is the title. So you can see I have a total of 5 different items that I am using as my mock data to pretend they're SharePoint list items as they're being rendered in this web part here. After I did that, the next thing I did was I created my mock HTTP client class. That's this one right here. I import my interface so I can work with it, and then I create an instance of a variable based on that interface to contain this array of items that represent my 5 different SharePoint list items. Then I create a get method here that I am able to call, which will return this particular list of mock SharePoint list items. The next thing that I did is I created a component, a React component, to actually render out these different mock list items here. So this React component is going to make up this bottom section of my web part where you can see my mouse moving on the right. That's the React component that's going to render these things out to the page. I went and created an iHelloWorld React props.ts, and actually I didn't create it. It came along with what the Yeoman generator created for me. And I imported that new interface I created, and then I added the lists to the export interface for this particular class. After I did that, I go to the Hello World React Web Part TS class. And inside of here, I'm going to import a few different things so that I can use them. The first thing I will import is my mock HTTP client class, as well as that interface so that I can use them here inside of this class. Then what I did was I added a method called getMockListData. That's right down here. When I call this method from my base web part class here, it's going to invoke the HTTP client's get method, and it's going to return me that list of mock SharePoint list items. Now that I've created a method that I can use to invoke the mock HTTP client, I'm going to go up to my render method, and it's here where I edited my render method so that now it will invoke that getMockListData method we just saw below. And then after that, it's going to use that React component to actually render those elements out to the screen. To style these items, I edited the SCSS file and I added in the list and the item values right here to style what these look like right here at the bottom of my web part. When I was done doing that, I went over to my Hello World React TSX file and I added the render method here that will actually render these things to the screen. So I misspoke before when I said the top part of the page was not part of the React component. It is. I forgot that I had that in here too. And that's where you can see that all these different things here are rendered out to the screen via my React component. The actual lists that are rendered are down here below. Notice in here, I also have the iHelloWorld React props class that I modified before, and I'm importing that
so that I can use that description and the lists. So you can see here, here's the description that's set in the property pane that gets rendered out. I can take a look at the property pane here and see that's my description. So if I change that like so, and then close my property pane, you can see that's how that property got updated into that React component. And then my mock data for my lists gets rendered out here. And there are my styles for the list and the item that I defined in the SCSS class. So those are the different things that I needed to do to make this React component work with the mock data inside of my SharePoint Framework web part. All the steps to do this are contained in the lab manual for this particular module, and you can walk through them all one by one to actually create this same exact web part.
In this section, we talked about what mock data is, why you want to use it, as well as how to go about using mock data in your SharePoint Framework solutions. You can learn more about SharePoint Framework and all the things we've talked about here in the SharePoint Patterns and Practices. You can get to this via the URL aka.ms/SharePointPNP. There's a ton of code samples and solutions, reusable components, a lot of guidance documentation, and also monthly community calls that you can watch here to learn all about the SharePoint Framework, SharePoint add-ins, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 APIs.